My name is Sarah, and I am in my early 60s. I was never what anyone would call wealthy, but I was a proud mother whose greatest treasures were not found in bank accounts or expensive possessions, but in the love I shared with my children and grandchildren. Even when life's circumstances made every dollar precious and every decision a careful calculation, I considered myself rich in the things that truly mattered. Now my modest home, my beloved family, and my very soul are being held hostage by forces I never could have imagined would enter my peaceful world. I dedicated my entire adult life to providing for my daughter with the fierce devotion that only a mother understands, working multiple jobs and making countless sacrifices to ensure she had opportunities I never enjoyed. When my grandchildren came along, I embraced my role as their protector and caregiver, shielding them from the world's harshness with the same unwavering love I had always given their mother. I sacrificed my own comfort and peace of mind countless times, always believing in the transformative power of unconditional love, never imagining that one day I would be forced to become a shield against a darkness that had been born within my own family circle. Then came the day when my son-in-law cornered me in my own kitchen, his presence suddenly feeling menacing in ways I had never experienced before. My meager finances, my desperate love for my family, the modest home I had worked so hard to maintain. He leveraged every vulnerable aspect of my life with the calculating precision of someone who had been studying my weaknesses for a long time. He demanded that I rent out my spare room for what he called his business activities. But the way his eyes went cold when he spoke told me everything I needed to know about the true nature of what he was planning. When I refused, when I tried to appeal to whatever decency might remain in him, he threatened the people I loved most in this world. Do what I say, or their lives are at risk. Your daughter, those precious grandchildren. Accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. I was forced to say yes while my soul screamed in protest, becoming an unwilling accomplice to crimes I couldn't even fully comprehend. My sanctuary, the home where I had raised my daughter and welcomed my grandchildren for countless happy visits, was being transformed into a den of criminal activity that filled me with constant terror and moral revulsion. Yet even amidst the overwhelming fear that now dominated my every waking moment, my forced proximity to his illicit dealings began revealing disturbing fragments of a larger picture. A peculiar car that appeared at odd hours, a recurring code word whispered during furtive phone calls, names spoken in hushed tones that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a simple demand from a desperate man. This was evidence of a vast, chilling criminal enterprise that reached far beyond anything I had initially understood. I knew with a certainty that made me sick to my stomach that he wasn't merely leveraging my fear for a quick solution to his problems. He was drawing me into a web of evil so complex and dangerous that it would leave lasting, indelible scars on my soul and transform my peaceful home into something I no longer recognized. My small, modest home, which had once been a haven of warmth filled with the sounds of children's laughter and family gatherings, where love was the most abundant ingredient in every meal, became a chilling reflection of the torment that now consumed my daily existence. Every familiar corner that had once brought me comfort now held the potential for terror, every cherished memory tainted by the knowledge of what was happening within these walls I had worked so hard to make into a sanctuary. The spare room, which had once been filled with toys and coloring books, where my grandchildren would build elaborate blanket forts and whisper secrets, now stood ominously empty, waiting to be filled with unspeakable acts that I could only imagine in my worst nightmares. The very air in that room seemed different now, heavy with anticipation of horrors that would soon unfold just steps away from where I tried to sleep each night. Every creak of the floorboards, sounds that had been familiar friends for decades, now sent jolts of terror through my entire body as I wondered whether each noise signaled the arrival of more criminals, more evidence of the evil I was being forced to enable. Every unfamiliar knock at the door made my heart race with panic, knowing that innocent neighbors or delivery people might be walking into a situation that could endanger them simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. My life, which had already been challenging enough with the financial struggles that seemed to define the existence of so many people, my age was now completely consumed by a pervasive fear for my daughter and grandchildren. Their innocence, which I had spent years protecting and nurturing, was now overshadowed by the encroaching darkness I was being forced to harbor within the very walls where they should have felt safest. The transformation of my home from sanctuary to prison happened so gradually and yet so completely that sometimes I felt like I was losing my mind, wondering if this nightmare was really happening, or if the stress of my circumstances had finally driven me to some kind of breakdown that made me imagine threats where none existed. My son-in-law moved through our home with an unsettling nonchalance that made my skin crawl, his presence transforming from merely unwelcome to genuinely terrifying in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew he held all the power in our relationship, someone who understood that I was completely trapped by my own love for the people he was threatening. His physical presence had become a constant suffocating weight that pressed down on every interaction, every conversation, every moment of what should have been peaceful family time. When he looked at me, I could see something cold and calculating behind his eyes, a complete absence of the empathy or family feeling that should have existed between us. Any attempt I made to question his activities, to appeal to whatever conscience he might still possess, to beg him to consider the impact his choices were having on his own wife and children, was met with a stare so cold and unwavering that it felt like looking into the eyes of a predator evaluating its prey. "You want your daughter to be safe?" he would ask, with a voice devoid of any warmth or genuine concern. "You want your grandkids to keep eating, to have a roof over their heads? Then you do exactly what I say, old woman. You don't ask questions, you don't interfere, and you definitely don't think about causing problems for me." His words carried a weight that went far beyond simple threats. They were promises delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has already decided exactly how far he's willing to go to protect his interests, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. His complete indifference to my moral agony, his casual cruelty towards someone who should have been family, solidified the terrifying understanding that I was truly trapped with no escape that wouldn't result in devastating consequences for the people I loved most. My pleas fell on ears that heard only what they chose to acknowledge my moral compass slowly eroding under his relentless pressure and the impossible choices he forced me to make every single day. Alone during the long sleepless nights that had become my new normal, consumed by guilt that ate away at my soul like acid, I found myself grappling with questions that had no good answers. How had this monster managed to infiltrate not just my home, but my family? How had I failed to see the warning signs that must have been there all along? I replayed every interaction I could remember, every instance of his gradually escalating influence over my daughter and grandchildren, searching desperately for the moment I had lost control of the situation, the precise point where his depravity had become my new reality. I blame myself for not being stronger, for not finding some way to protect my family from this threat that had emerged from within our own circle. The weight of my own complicity, however forced and unwilling it might be, was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. I had always prided myself on being a person of integrity, someone who did the right thing even when it was difficult or costly. But now I was actively participating in criminal activities simply by allowing them to happen in my home. Then I would rage against the helplessness of my situation, against the impossible choice between enabling criminal activity and putting my family in mortal danger, against a world where such evil could flourish while good people suffered in silence. Finally, I would sink into a fog of profound moral confusion that made me question everything I thought I knew about right and wrong, about family loyalty, about the price we're willing to pay to protect the people we love. His words, always delivered with a chilling calm that made them even more terrifying, aimed directly at my deepest vulnerabilities and strongest instincts as a mother and grandmother. "This is just how things are now," he would say, with the authority of someone explaining natural law rather than criminal coercion. "Don't make things worse for them by fighting against reality. You have no choice in this matter. Do you understand me?" He had perfected the art of twisting my selfless love for my family into a narrative where my cooperation was not just necessary, but somehow my own choice, my own acceptance of circumstances that I had supposedly brought upon myself. He would hint at my inability to provide adequately for my family on my limited income, subtly reinforcing my financial insecurity while making me question whether my poverty had somehow forced his hand in this situation. The psychological torment was relentless and expertly crafted, designed to make me doubt my deepest moral instincts while drowning me in self-doubt, until I truly feared I was losing not just my peace of mind, but my very soul. I found myself caught in his web of false protection, where my cooperation was presented as the only thing standing between my family and disaster. Yet somehow, through the suffocating haze of terror and guilt that had become my constant companions, a stubborn flicker of perception and intelligence remained alive within me like an ember that refused to be completely extinguished. My forced proximity to his illicit activities, however unwilling and terrifying it might be, meant that I inevitably began picking up small but significant details about what was really happening in my home. The recurring black sedan that pulled up to my curb at odd hours, its occupants speaking in hushed, urgent tones that carried the unmistakable weight of serious criminal business. A peculiar, almost sweet chemical scent that lingered in the spare room long after his associates had finished whatever business they conducted. There a smell that made my stomach turn with its implications. The way he would subtly palm small, tightly rolled bills from his pocket when he thought no one was watching, conducting financial transactions with the practiced ease of someone who had been in this business for a very long time. The specific way he would position himself near windows during these meetings, always maintaining sightlines to both the street and the interior of the house, with the vigilance of someone who expected trouble. These observations weren't direct proof of any specific crimes, but they coalesced into a chilling internal mosaic that painted a picture far more disturbing than anything I had initially imagined. He wasn't just demanding the use of my room for occasional illegal activities. He was running a significant, sophisticated criminal operation that used my home as its primary base, making me not just a witness, but an active accomplice in whatever horrors were being planned and executed within my own walls. I was living a perpetual nightmare where every day brought new evidence of my unwilling participation in evil I couldn't fully comprehend, trapped by love for my family, while my conscience screamed in protest against everything I was being forced to enable and endure. One morning, while retrieving a small toy car that belonged to my youngest grandson and had somehow rolled under the door of the spare room, I discovered something that would forever change my understanding of the scope and nature of the criminal enterprise operating out of my home. As I knelt down to reach for the toy, stretching my arm under the narrow gap beneath the door, my fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible piece of torn paper that had been tucked deep into the carpet fibers, so small and well hidden that it would have been impossible to notice unless you were looking at floor level from exactly the right angle. The fragment appeared to be part of a calendar page with a specific date circled in red ink and marked with a cryptic initial that looked like the letter M, written in a distinctive angular handwriting. On its own, this scrap of paper might have seemed completely insignificant, the kind of random debris that accumulates in any home over time and gets overlooked during routine cleaning. But something about its placement and the deliberate way it had been hidden made it snag at my consciousness, like a thorn triggering a flicker of cold awareness that made my hands shake as I held it. This wasn't just evidence of casual activity or the normal detritus of daily life. The careful concealment and the specific markings suggested a level of meticulous, chilling organization to his illicit dealings that went far beyond anything I had previously imagined. This small piece of paper represented planning, coordination, and systematic criminal activity that operated according to schedules and codes that I was only beginning to glimpse. This discovery, combined with a fragmented memory of a phone conversation I had accidentally overheard just days earlier, began to paint a picture that made my blood run cold with its implications. I remembered my son-in-law speaking in a voice that was both theatrical and precisely controlled, using language that was clearly designed to disguise the true nature of what he was discussing. "The merchandise has arrived," he had said, with the kind of casual authority that comes from someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Everything is proceeding according to schedule. The storage facility is secure and ready for the next phase of operations." At the time, I had dismissed the conversation as probably related to some legitimate business venture, perhaps something involving shipping or warehousing that might explain his frequent meetings and the stream of visitors who came to our home at odd hours. But now, holding this calendar fragment with its mysterious markings, the memory took on a much darker significance. The casual use of obvious code words, the reference to merchandise and storage facilities, the way he had spoken about schedules and phases of operations, all of this suggested not just illegal activity, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise with multiple moving parts and carefully coordinated timing. It wasn't just about his immediate demands on my home and my cooperation. It implied the existence of a deeper, wider criminal network, with him serving as a significant and ruthless player rather than just a desperate individual making poor choices. The realization that my home was being used not just for storage or meetings, but as an active coordination center for organized criminal activity made me feel physically sick. As these disturbing realizations began to crystallize in my mind, I found myself remembering details from years past that I had previously dismissed as simply part of my son-in-law's difficult personality. There had been a period of erratic behavior that my daughter had explained away as work stress or personal struggles, asking me to be patient with him during what she described as a challenging time in his life. I recalled unexplained periods of wealth, followed by equally mysterious financial difficulties, sudden mood swings that could transform him from charming and generous to violent and unpredictable without any apparent trigger. There had been unexplained disappearances where he would be gone for days at a time, returning with vague explanations about business trips or family emergencies that never quite made sense when I tried to piece them together. At the time, concerned primarily with supporting my daughter through what seemed like marital difficulties, I had seen these behaviors as personality flaws, or perhaps signs of mental health issues that might improve with time and patience. I had encouraged my daughter to be understanding, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to focus on the positive aspects of their relationship. Now, however, these memories resurfaced with chilling clarity, aligning perfectly with what I was learning about his current criminal activities. This wasn't a recent descent into illegal behavior brought on by desperation or temporary circumstances. This was evidence of a long-standing pattern of calculated, escalating criminal conduct that had been hidden beneath a carefully maintained facade of normal family life. The realization that I had been so completely blind to the true nature of the man my daughter had married that I had actually encouraged her to stay with someone capable of such systematic evil made me question everything I thought I knew about my own judgment and protective instincts as a mother. Several days after my disturbing discovery, during what should have been a normal family dinner where we all pretended that everything was fine and normal, I decided to test the boundaries of his knowledge and control with what I hoped would appear to be innocent curiosity about household matters. I found this little scrap of paper while cleaning, I said as casually as I could manage, placing the calendar fragment on the table near his plate. Just a date and what looks like the letter M. Perhaps it stands for Maria, or maybe Michael. I thought you might know if it was important to anyone. The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable, more dramatic than anything I had expected or prepared myself to witness. His usual composure, the carefully controlled mask he wore during family interactions, shattered completely in a matter of seconds. His fork clattered against his plate with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that filled the room. His eyes, which normally maintained a cold but controlled calculation, flashed with something raw and dangerous, a combination of uncharacteristic fear and volcanic anger that made me instinctively lean away from him, even though we were sitting at opposite ends of the table. "Why are you rummaging through my things, old woman?" He hissed, his voice sharp and venomous, in a way that transformed him from family member into obvious threat. "I told you to mind your own business and leave things alone. Don't you understand what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong?" His reaction went far beyond what any innocent person would display when confronted with a random piece of paper found during routine cleaning. This was the response of someone who knew exactly what that fragment represented and understood that its discovery could threaten carefully laid plans that involved much more than I had realized. "Unless you want to make things much worse for everyone in this family," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have been, "you'll forget you ever saw that, and you'll be much more careful about where you go and what you touch in the future." His uncharacteristic agitation and his rapid, furious warning confirmed every terrible suspicion that had been growing in my mind about the scope and danger of his criminal activities. I was getting too close to understanding something he desperately needed to keep hidden, and his awareness of my investigation was intensifying both my terror and my determination to understand exactly what I had gotten my family involved in. The incident made it crystal clear that my situation was far more precarious than I had realized, that any further investigation would need to be conducted with extreme caution, and that the consequences of discovery could be devastating, not just for me, but for everyone I loved. The pieces of this horrible puzzle were still frustratingly disjointed and incomplete, scattered across months of careful observation and protected by layers of secrecy that would require much more than casual investigation to penetrate fully. But the weight of this partial knowledge felt absolutely crushing, pressing down on me like a physical force that made it difficult to breathe or think clearly about what my next steps should be. My growing understanding confirmed the most chilling suspicion I had been afraid to fully acknowledge. My son-in-law wasn't just a small-time criminal who had made some poor choices and gotten in over his head. He was deeply enmeshed in a dangerous, highly organized criminal network that used sophisticated planning-coded communications and systematic intimidation to maintain its operations. My home wasn't just being used for storage or occasional meetings. It had become an active hub for coordinating serious criminal activities that could result in prison sentences or worse for everyone involved. I was no longer just an unwilling landlord. I was a crucial accomplice in an enterprise that could destroy not just my own life, but the lives of my daughter and grandchildren if it was ever discovered by law enforcement. This wasn't the closure or relief that comes from solving a mystery. It was the disturbing confirmation of profound, pervasive malevolence that reached far beyond anything I had imagined possible. Yet I still lacked the kind of coherent, actionable proof that would allow me to expose him safely. And I had no means to take meaningful action without devastating consequences for my family. The unease that had been growing inside me intensified into a constant thrumming anxiety that colored every interaction with dread and suspicion. Rather than feeling empowered by my discoveries, I felt more anxious and heartbroken than ever before, knowing the true depth of the depravity I was facing, while remaining essentially helpless to protect the people I loved most from its consequences. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to understand the complete scope of the criminal enterprise I was being forced to enable within my own home, I began conducting what could only be described as a covert internal investigation that became my secret obsession, and the only way I could maintain any sense of control over my rapidly deteriorating situation. During my brief moments of genuine solitude, when his surveillance relaxed just enough to allow me some mental privacy, I would carefully cross-reference the coded words and phrases I overheard during his phone calls, with snippets of information from local news reports about criminal activity in our area and neighboring communities. The connections I discovered were both fascinating and terrifying in their precision and scope. Terms like merchandise delivery and storage facility maintenance that he used in his conversations corresponded with news reports about drug trafficking and organized crime operations that law enforcement was attempting to track and shut down throughout our region. I strained to overhear fragments of his hushed conversations with the various associates who visited our home at all hours, piecing together clues about their methods of operation, their territories of influence, and their techniques for intimidating anyone who might threaten their activities. These weren't casual criminals or desperate individuals making poor choices. These were professional operators who spoke about violence and intimidation with the same casual efficiency that others might use to discuss business logistics. My mind, though constantly weary from the stress of living under threat, became sharper and more focused in this one crucial area, transformed by desperation into an instrument capable of detecting patterns and connections that my previous trusting nature would never have noticed. Every small piece of information felt like a victory proof that some essential part of me remained capable of independent thought and analysis, despite their best efforts to reduce me to a compliant accomplice. Through weeks of careful observation and analysis of their careless remarks, comments they made when they thought I was too frightened or distracted to understand the implications, a clearer and infinitely more disturbing picture began to emerge of their true motivations and methods. Their business wasn't merely about generating quick money to solve immediate financial problems, goals that would have been understandable if morally questionable. What they had built was a vast, sprawling criminal enterprise designed to accumulate untraceable wealth and political influence while establishing absolute control over everyone within their sphere of operation. The systematic exploitation of my home, the terrifying threats against my family, the careful manipulation of my fears and vulnerabilities. All of these tactics were part of a comprehensive strategy to secure their operations while eliminating any possibility of interference from law enforcement or rival criminal organizations. They needed to ensure that I remained not just silent, but completely compliant, a witness who could be trusted never to speak about what she had seen, while providing them with a base of operations that appeared completely legitimate to any outside observer. My home represented the perfect cover for their activities. A modest house owned by an elderly woman with no criminal history and no apparent connections to organized crime. As my subtle observations and growing awareness began to penetrate their assumptions about my passivity and ignorance, their tactics evolved in ways that became noticeably more desperate and overtly threatening. They seemed to sense that something had changed in my level of compliance, that I was somehow becoming more resistant to their psychological manipulation despite their careful management of my circumstances. The back door of my home, which had always been a convenient entrance for family members and close friends, suddenly developed a security problem that made it impossible to use safely. My son-in-law claimed that the lock mechanism had become unreliable and potentially dangerous, requiring expensive repairs that we couldn't afford right away. This forced all visitors to use the front entrance, which happened to provide him with a clear line of sight to monitor everyone who came and went from our home. What had once been presented as a minor household inconvenience was actually a sophisticated surveillance measure designed to ensure that no one could enter or leave without his knowledge and approval. My few remaining cherished possessions, particularly a small engraved silver locket that had belonged to my own mother and served as my most precious connection to family history and personal integrity, would occasionally appear in different locations around the house without any explanation for how they had been moved. These seemingly innocent relocations served as chilling reminders that my privacy was completely non-existent, that he was monitoring my movements and activities with the thoroughness of a professional security operation. Every possession that mattered to me had become a potential tool for psychological manipulation, a way of demonstrating his complete control over every aspect of my environment. He began systematically poisoning my reputation among the neighbors and community members who had known and respected me for years, spreading carefully crafted stories about my declining mental state and increasingly odd behaviors that made me appear unreliable and potentially unstable to anyone who might otherwise take my concerns seriously. These character assassination campaigns served multiple purposes. They isolated me further by discouraging people from maintaining contact with me, while simultaneously creating a narrative that would discredit anything I might say if I ever found an opportunity to speak out about what was happening in my home. The portrait he painted was of an elderly woman whose mind had been affected by the stresses of aging and financial difficulty. Someone whose claims about criminal activities and death threats would be dismissed as the confused fantasies of a person who could no longer distinguish reality from paranoid imagination. His casual jokes about how easily accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business intensified until they became a constant drumbeat of psychological terrorism designed to reinforce my sense of vulnerability and dependence on his protection. Every conversation included subtle reminders of my isolation and helplessness, carefully phrased warnings about the dangers that awaited anyone foolish enough to interfere in matters they didn't understand. "You know, Sarah," he would say with false concern while reading newspaper accounts of traffic accidents or sudden illnesses that had befallen local residents. "It's such a dangerous world out there for people who don't have family looking out for them. You're so fortunate to have someone who understands how to keep you safe from all these unpredictable tragedies that seem to strike people when they least expect it." The relentless combination of psychological manipulation and increasingly overt threats began taking a devastating toll on every aspect of my physical and emotional well-being. Sleep became almost impossible, offering no respite from the daily assault on my sense of security and sanity, only fractured dreams filled with images of my grandchildren's innocent faces, marred by fear and confusion. My body began to reflect the stress of living under constant threat, developing persistent aches that seemed to emanate from my very bones and made every movement feel labored and painful. My appetite disappeared entirely as the anxiety of never knowing what new threat might emerge made the simple act of eating feel impossible. My hands developed a tremor that wasn't related to age, but rather to the constant internal terror of never knowing when his patience with my continued existence might finally run out. The physical manifestations of fear became harder to hide, providing him with additional evidence he could use to support his narrative of my declining mental and physical health. I felt utterly trapped in a web of criminal conspiracy and family manipulation so complete that every attempt to understand or resist it only seemed to tighten the bonds that held me captive. The weight of his combined depravity was slowly crushing whatever remained of my spirit, grinding down the strong, independent woman I had always been, until I feared there would be nothing left but a terrified accomplice to crimes I could never safely report. This was no longer simply a fight for my own safety or peace of mind. It had become a desperate battle for my very soul against people who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their interests, including the grandmother who should have been able to count on their protection and respect rather than becoming their victim and unwilling partner in evil. The moment of devastating clarity arrived, like lightning splitting through a dark sky, illuminating a landscape of evil so complete and organized that it made my blood turn to ice and confirmed every terrible fear I had been trying to convince myself might be exaggerated or imagined. It happened on what had started as an ordinary afternoon, when a simple mistake on his part would forever change my understanding of the true scope of the criminal enterprise operating out of my modest home. My son-in-law had been conducting one of his typical phone conversations in the spare room, speaking in the coded language I had learned to recognize as the vocabulary of serious criminal business. After finishing his call and gathering what appeared to be financial documents from the desk he had installed without my permission, he made a critical error that would expose the heart of his operation. In his haste to leave for what he claimed was a business meeting, He carelessly left his laptop computer open and running on the makeshift desk, the screen displaying information that was clearly never intended for my eyes or anyone else outside his trusted circle of criminal associates. Moving closer, with a mixture of terror and desperate curiosity, I found myself staring at a chilling spreadsheet that contained more damning evidence than I could have gathered through months of careful observation and eavesdropping. The document was filled with names, dates, and monetary amounts so large they made my modest retirement income seem like pocket change by comparison. Some of the names listed in the spreadsheet were ones I recognized from my mental notes, key players in his network, whose voices I had heard during late-night phone calls and whose faces I had glimpsed during furtive meetings in my spare room. But many others were completely unfamiliar, suggesting that his criminal enterprise reached far beyond anything I had previously imagined. The spreadsheet contained detailed information about shipments with arrival dates and distribution schedules, collections with specific monetary targets and enforcement protocols, and territories with geographic boundaries and operational responsibilities that painted a picture of organized crime on a scale that dwarfed anything I had seen in movies or television shows. This was concrete, undeniable proof that went far beyond my previous circumstantial observations and fragmented conversations. The evidence on that screen demonstrated beyond any doubt that this wasn't merely local drug dealing or small-time criminal activity designed to supplement his income during difficult financial periods. He was a major orchestrator in a vast criminal network, someone with significant responsibility for coordinating illegal activities across multiple communities and managing the kind of money that attracted serious law enforcement attention. My home wasn't just being used as convenient storage space. It had become a central hub for his illicit empire, a coordination center for criminal activities that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. The full scope of his depravity and my forced complicity in enabling it was laid bare on that computer screen in terms so clear and specific that no amount of denial or rationalization could obscure their meaning. I was not just an unwilling landlord or a frightened grandmother being manipulated through threats. I was an active participant in a criminal conspiracy that reached into multiple states and involved millions of dollars in illegal transactions. The truth, now fully revealed in all its ugly completeness, was more devastating than anything I could have imagined, even in my darkest moments of fear and suspicion. My son-in-law wasn't just exploiting my poverty and my love for my family as convenient tools for advancing his criminal career. He was a ruthless criminal mastermind who had systematically transformed my home and my family relationships into essential components of his vast illicit enterprise. He was someone willing to threaten innocent children, to manipulate elderly family members, to destroy the lives of anyone who stood between him and his criminal objectives. The systematic exploitation of my financial desperation, the calculated use of my grandchildren as leverage, the transformation of my home into a base of operations for serious criminal activity. All of these represented not desperate measures taken by someone in temporary difficulty, but carefully planned strategies implemented by someone with no conscience or moral limitations. This was a betrayal so profound and complete that it severed every last thread of trust, every cherished memory of family peace and harmony, every assumption I had ever made about the basic decency that should exist between people who share blood and claim to love each other. There was no room for misunderstanding here, no possibility of charitable interpretation or hope for eventual redemption. This was pure calculated evil, a chilling systematic act of avarice and depravity designed to force me into permanent complicity while using my family bonds as chains that would keep me silent and obedient, regardless of what crimes I was forced to witness or enable. Later that same day, as he sat in my living room with the casual confidence of someone who believed his secret was safe, counting what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash, with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to handling large sums of illegal money, I made a decision that terrified me even as I acted on it. I looked directly into his eyes with a gaze as clear and steady as I could manage, summoning every ounce of courage I had left to confront him with what I had discovered. "I know," I whispered, my voice raspy from fear but firm with conviction. "I know what you're doing. Everything. The whole operation." The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and more frightening than anything I had prepared myself to witness. His hand froze in mid-count, the bills scattered across his lap as his entire body went rigid with what could only be described as predatory fury. His eyes, which normally maintained a cold but controlled calculation, flashed with something raw and dangerous that made every instinct scream at me to run. He dropped the remaining money without concern for where it fell, reaching out to grab my arm with a grip so tight and brutal that I knew it would leave marks for days to come. His fingers pressed into my flesh with the kind of pressure designed to cause pain, while leaving evidence of his willingness to escalate to physical violence if psychological intimidation proved insufficient. "You know nothing, old woman," he hissed, his voice carrying a venom that transformed him from family member into obvious threat. "You understand nothing about what you're talking about. And if you ever breathe a word of your confused fantasies to anyone at all, I want you to remember very carefully what happens to grandmothers who can't keep their mouths shut." His denial was immediate and absolute, but it was the specific nature of his threat that made my blood run cold. "Remember the children," he whispered, his voice dropping to a level that somehow felt more menacing than shouting would have been. "Remember how much they depend on you to make smart choices about what you say and what you keep to yourself." My daughter, who had been hovering nearby during this exchange, quickly looked away when she heard his threatening words, her face pale with what could only be described as familiar fear. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know about how long she had been living under his control, how completely he had isolated her from any source of help or support that might challenge his authority. Her inability to meet my eyes, her obvious terror at witnessing this confrontation, served as devastating confirmation that she was as much a prisoner in this situation as I was trapped by the same threats against the children that he was now using to ensure my silence and cooperation. His brutal denial, combined with his immediate escalation to physical intimidation and specific threats against my grandchildren, served as silent but unmistakable confirmation of everything I had suspected and feared about his true nature and criminal activities. This wasn't the response of an innocent person wrongly accused. This was the reaction of a professional criminal whose carefully constructed operation had been discovered by someone in a position to cause serious problems. The confrontation felt less like an exchange of words than a battle between souls, a moment when all pretense fell away, and we faced each other as what we really were, predator and prey destroyer and victim, evil, triumphant over love and family loyalty, corrupted beyond any possibility of redemption. It left me simultaneously shattered by the confirmation of my worst fears, and strangely relieved to finally know beyond any doubt that my instincts about the danger surrounding my family had been accurate. There would be no reconciliation, no appeal to whatever humanity might remain within him, no hope that family bonds might eventually prove stronger than criminal ambition. His reaction to my moment of clarity solidified my understanding that he was beyond any possibility of redemption, explanation, or appeal to basic human decency. The malice I had sensed beneath his performance wasn't the product of desperation or unfortunate circumstances. It was a fundamental part of his character, a coldness so complete that it remained constant even when directly confronted with the suffering he was causing. The malice remained exactly as it had always been, manifesting as casual cruelty toward me and veiled but unmistakable threats toward my family. The illegal activities not only continued, but seemed to intensify after my brief moment of clarity, becoming more oppressive than ever, as if he were punishing me for my awareness and determination to prevent any future lapses in his control. I realized with crushing finality that true emotional closure, genuine acknowledgement of his crimes, or any form of justice from the person who had destroyed my family's peace was an impossible dream that would never be fulfilled. He had committed what he believed was the perfect crime, one that used my own love for my family against me while making me appear to be a willing accomplice rather than a victim of systematic coercion. My heart ached with a chilling sense of permanent estrangement that went far beyond my separation from the peaceful life I had once known. I was estranged from my daughter, who was lost to her own fear of him, and from the very concept of family itself, which had been corrupted beyond recognition by his profound depravity and criminal ambition. My only remaining path was to endure this reality with whatever dignity I could preserve, to survive as a reluctant accomplice while protecting my family from retaliation. I was living as a monument to his insidious cruelty, trapped within my own home that had become both my cage and the headquarters for criminal activities I could never safely report or escape. I now carried the full crushing weight of this terrifying truth like a physical burden that made every breath feel labored and every moment of consciousness a struggle against complete despair. I was living as a reluctant accomplice to a vast criminal enterprise that reached far beyond my modest home, existing under the constant threat of a ruthless man who held my family's safety hostage while using my love for them as the primary weapon in his arsenal of control. This truth was too monstrous and dangerous to share with anyone too incriminating to voice without essentially signing confessions for crimes I had been forced to enable against my will. Who would believe the claims of an elderly woman who would necessarily have to admit her own complicity in serious criminal activities when making accusations against someone who had carefully cultivated an image of respectability and success? My son-in-law had spent years building relationships within our community, presenting himself as a devoted family man who had overcome economic hardship through hard work and smart business decisions. Any attempt to expose his true nature would be met with skepticism from people who saw only the surface image he had crafted, while my own credibility would be destroyed by the necessity of admitting my role in providing him with a base of operations. Worse than simply being dismissed as a confused elderly woman, making wild accusations, speaking out, would certainly lead to my immediate elimination as a threat to his operation, and could easily result in devastating retaliation against my daughter and grandchildren. The man I was dealing with had demonstrated his willingness to use violence and intimidation as routine business tools. There was no reason to believe he would hesitate to escalate to lethal force if he felt sufficiently threatened. The secret of what was happening in my home burned like a coal of shame and terror in my heart, heavy and isolating, creating a constant reminder that I had become the very thing I had spent my entire life trying to avoid, someone who enabled criminal activity through my silence and cooperation. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but sharing it would only accelerate the timeline of destruction for everyone I loved. Standing alone in the bedroom that had once been my private sanctuary, but now felt like a cell in an elaborate prison designed to look like a normal family home, I found myself facing the most desolate crossroads a human being can encounter. The choice before me would determine not just how I spent whatever time remained to me, but whether my family would survive my decision intact. To fight for external justice, to somehow find a way to expose what I knew to law enforcement agencies or journalists who might investigate his criminal network, would require a level of evidence and credibility that I simply didn't possess. More importantly, it would mean risking total retaliation, not just against myself, but against my daughter and grandchildren, who were even more vulnerable than I was. I had seen enough of his operation to understand that he had resources connections and demonstrated willingness to eliminate problems through violence. Any attempt to challenge him directly would be like declaring war against a professional army while armed with nothing but good intentions and moral outrage. The alternative path stretched before me like a descent into a different kind of hell, choosing a strategy of silent survival, accepting my role as an unwilling accomplice, while focusing all my energy on protecting my family and preserving whatever fragments of my integrity could survive under impossible circumstances. This wasn't surrender, though I knew that's how any observer would interpret it. It was a form of strategic wisdom, a recognition that some battles cannot be won through direct confrontation when the enemy holds all the advantages and the victims have been systematically stripped of every resource that might level the playing field. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it might be one of my last, as the independent woman I had always believed myself to be, I made the decision that would define whatever remained of my existence. It was born not of surrender to his evil, though I knew he would see it that way, but of grim necessity and overwhelming maternal love that demanded I prioritize my family's survival over my own moral comfort. I would not pursue external justice or attempt to expose his crimes to a world that would likely dismiss my claims while destroying my family in the process. My survival and the fragile hope of keeping my daughter and grandchildren safe from direct retaliation demanded a different kind of strategy, a retreat into internal resilience that might allow me to preserve whatever remained of my authentic self while maintaining the silence he demanded. It was a painful acknowledgement of complete powerlessness, a recognition that some battles, however righteous and necessary they might be, cannot be won by confronting deeply entrenched evil when one has been left so utterly vulnerable and defenseless. My focus would shift from fighting him to simply surviving him, from trying to expose his crimes to protecting my family while documenting what I observed, in case someday, somehow the information might be useful to someone with the power to act on it. This decision brought with it a terrible kind of peace, the relief that comes from finally accepting a reality too dangerous to continue fighting against. I would endure rather than resist, preserve, rather than expose, survive, rather than seek justice. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the only one that offered any possibility of keeping my family alive. My son-in-law's criminal enterprise continued to flourish, with each passing month his operations expanding and his profits growing as he reinvested his illegal gains into bigger and more sophisticated criminal ventures. He brought increasing amounts of money into our home, using his wealth to buy lavish gifts for my daughter and even my grandchildren in a sickening charade of being a loving provider who had earned his prosperity through legitimate means. He He moved through the world with brazen confidence, his facade of respectability becoming more polished and convincing with each public appearance, while I withered in the gilded cage I had helped him construct around my family. Every expensive toy he gave my grandchildren, every piece of jewelry he presented to my daughter, every family vacation he funded with criminal proceeds felt like another chain binding us to his operation. He continued to present a flawless performance of the devoted family man to anyone outside our immediate household, subtly reinforcing stories about my increasing frailty or moodiness to any visitor who might notice signs of the stress I was under. His character assassination was so skillful that even people who had known me for years began to see me as a somewhat difficult elderly woman who was fortunate to have such a patient and caring son-in-law. This painful dichotomy between his brazen success and my internal agony created a daily reminder of how indifferent the world could be to hidden corruption, how easily society celebrated those who achieved apparent prosperity while remaining blind to the methods used to obtain it and the victims destroyed in the process. The contrast highlighted something fundamental about human nature that I had never wanted to understand, that evil often prospers precisely because it presents such an attractive surface to the world while its victims suffer in silence and isolation, their cries for help dismissed as the confused complaints of minds that can no longer be trusted to interpret reality accurately. That evening, after making my terrible decision to abandon any hope of external justice, I allowed myself one small act of quiet defiance that he could never detect or prevent. In the privacy of my room, I retrieved my small engraved silver locket from my dresser drawer, handling it with the reverence others might reserve for sacred relics or precious family heirlooms. I opened the delicate clasp with trembling fingers and gazed at the faded photograph of my own mother that I had carried with me for decades, her eyes filled with the kindness and moral strength that had shaped my character during my formative years. Looking at her face, I could almost hear her voice, reminding me that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that nobody else can see, the internal triumphs that preserve our essential selves, even when everything external has been stripped away. I clutched the locket tight against my chest, feeling its warmth as a tangible connection to the woman who had taught me the difference between right and wrong, who had shown me that love sometimes requires sacrifices that seem to destroy the very person making them. It was a small, quiet act of self-preservation, a personal vow to preserve whatever remained of my moral core, even if I could no longer act on my convictions without endangering the people I loved most. Then I began silently reciting the names of my grandchildren, like a prayer or meditation, creating a private litany of love that served as my declaration of quiet internal resistance against total despair. Each name represented hope for the future, a reason to continue enduring the unendurable, a reminder that some forms of love transcend even the most impossible circumstances. This was my way of embracing whatever remained of my authentic self, while accepting that the external battle was lost beyond any hope of recovery, my strategy for finding meaning and survival when victory was impossible. My days gradually evolved into a delicate internal dance, a careful navigation through the treacherous landscape of his dangerous reality that required all my remaining mental strength and emotional resilience to survive with any fragment of my authentic self intact. I had learned to exist in two separate worlds simultaneously, the external world he had constructed around me, and the internal sanctuary where my true thoughts and values could still flourish beyond his reach. I discovered unexpected solace in quiet, intensely private moments that existed in the spaces between his surveillance and control, tiny refuges of peace that he couldn't monitor or manipulate because they occurred entirely within the hidden realm of my own consciousness. Most precious of all were the times when I could focus completely on the intricate patterns of sunlight as it moved across the worn area rug in my living room, finding meditative peace in the simple, undeniable existence of natural phenomena he could never corrupt or claim. These shifting patterns of light and shadow became symbols of truth and beauty that persisted independent of human manipulation, following laws of physics and astronomy that remained constant regardless of the lies and criminal activities that surrounded me. Watching the gradual progression of sunshine across familiar surfaces became a form of prayer, a way of connecting with something pure and authentic in a world that had been systematically stripped of genuine meaning. I spent hours silently tending to a tiny pot of basil I had secretly placed on my windowsill, nurturing this small symbol of life, persisting despite hostile conditions. Its vibrant green leaves and distinctive fragrance served as a quiet rebellion against the lingering chemical odors that sometimes drifted from the spare room after his associates finished whatever business they conducted there. The simple act of caring for this hidden plant became an assertion of my continuing humanity, proof that I retained the capacity to nurture and protect something innocent, even when I couldn't protect myself or my family. Each new leaf that unfurled was evidence that life could continue to flourish, even in the most controlled environments, that beauty and growth were possible, even when surrounded by evil. These weren't grand gestures of escape or dramatic acts of resistance that might attract his attention and bring down new forms of punishment on my head. They were tiny, desperate measures to preserve my inner world, creating hidden sanctuaries against his lies that existed in the private spaces of my consciousness, where his manufactured reality couldn't quite penetrate completely. The simple act of maintaining these internal refuges became a quiet rebellion for my soul, a way of asserting that some essential part of me remained untouchable, regardless of how completely he controlled my external circumstances. Human connection had become almost impossibly rare in my isolated existence, but when it did occur, it felt more precious than any material wealth, more vital than anything I had lost through his systematic destruction of my normal life. The kind elderly neighbor who occasionally left a plate of homemade cookies on my doorstep possessed an intuitive understanding that went far beyond simple neighborly courtesy. Her brief, compassionate smile when our paths crossed in the yard served as a lifeline that reminded me I was still visible to the outside world, still recognized as a human being worthy of basic kindness and consideration. She never pressed me for explanations about the changes in my household or the strange visitors who came and went at all hours, but her gentle presence provided validation that some people still cared about my well-being. Even the young delivery person who brought packages and mail to our home took on profound significance in my starved emotional landscape. His brief friendly nod and genuine smile during our minimal interactions became evidence that courtesy and human decency still existed in the world beyond the criminal enterprise that had consumed my family. These people weren't confidants in any traditional sense. I could never risk sharing the truth of my situation with them, knowing it would only result in their becoming targets for intimidation or worse. But they provided external validation that I was still seen and acknowledged as real, offering fragile connections to the world of genuine human interaction that existed beyond the carefully controlled boundaries of my psychological prison. The hunger for authentic human contact had become so intense that even these minimal interactions felt like glimpses of salvation to someone drowning in isolation. The distant sound of children playing outside my window could feel like a warm, supportive touch from the innocent world. I longed to protect, a reminder that life continued to exist and flourish in ways he could never completely control or corrupt. I began engaging in what became my most important form of internal rebellion and psychological preservation. Using only my mind as both instrument and repository, I started secretly composing a comprehensive narrative of truth, creating a silent chronicle that documented his cruelty, his methods, his network, and the systematic way he had destroyed my family's peace and security. This wasn't documentation I could commit to paper, which would have been discovered and used against me, but rather a vivid, detailed mental record assembled from the fragments of evidence I inadvertently gathered through my forced proximity to his criminal operations. I organized conversations I had overheard, license plate numbers I had memorized, names and faces that had appeared repeatedly in his business dealings. The internal chronicling became a meticulous act of bearing witness, a desperate attempt to keep the truth alive in my consciousness, even if I could never safely share it with anyone else. Every detail I preserved in memory was proof that my observational skills remained sharp, and my understanding of his true nature was based on careful analysis rather than paranoid imagination. This mental documentation became my quiet act of rebellion, my way of ensuring that his depravity was not forgotten or dismissed, even if the evidence existed only within my own thoughts. It served as my anchor during the worst moments of psychological manipulation, reminding me that I retained the ability to think clearly and observe accurately despite his best efforts to convince me otherwise. The internal passion for truth and accuracy became my secret triumph, my silent defiance against his systematic attempts to rewrite reality according to his preferences. It was a testament to my enduring intellect and moral fortitude, proof that some essential part of me remained uncorrupted by his influence and capable of independent thought and moral judgment. This harrowing chronicle of my forced complicity also served a practical purpose. If anything ever happened to me, if I was eliminated as a threat or simply died from the stress of my circumstances, this information would die with me. But at least I would have the satisfaction of knowing that someone had witnessed and recorded his crimes, even if that someone could never safely speak about them. Yet even these small victories against complete intellectual erasure were shadowed by the constant oppressive presence of his criminal activities and the subtle but persistent shifts in his mood that served as barometers for the danger levels surrounding my family. The low murmur of his phone calls, conducting illegal business, the late-night visitors who came and went, like shadows, the casual discussions of violence and intimidation. All of these served as constant reminders of my vulnerability. His presence ensured that the deep, aching wound of my lost integrity and violated trust never had a chance to heal or even begin to close. The question of whether we would survive this nightmare, whether my grandchildren would grow up safely or become victims of his escalating criminal ambitions, became a constant thrum in the background of my consciousness. The superficial joy my grandchildren displayed in their innocent unawareness of the danger surrounding them was perhaps the most painful aspect of my daily existence. Watching them play with expensive toys purchased with criminal proceeds, seeing them laugh and smile while living in the headquarters of serious criminal operations, created a constant reminder of the terrible price I was paying for their temporary safety, and the moral compromises I had been forced to make to protect them from immediate harm. The triggering moment arrived without warning during what had seemed like an ordinary afternoon of enforced normalcy, shattering the fragile emotional equilibrium I had been carefully constructing within the confines of my internal world. It began when my youngest grandchild, blissfully oblivious to the danger that surrounded our daily existence, wandered into the spare room while chasing a ball that had bounced away from their play area. Children possess an innocent curiosity that draws them toward anything bright or unusual, and something glittering on the floor had caught their attention like a magnet pulling metal. As I watched in horror from the doorway, I saw that tiny, trusting hand reaching toward what was clearly not a toy, but rather a small, ornate knife that had been carelessly left behind after one of his business meetings. The blade caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, creating the kind of sparkling display that would naturally attract a child's attention while representing everything deadly and corrupt about the world that had invaded our home. This wasn't a kitchen utensil or innocent tool. This was obviously a weapon, something designed for intimidation and violence that had no business existing in the same space where children played and families were supposed to feel safe. The sight of that innocent hand reaching for such a clear symbol of his depravity ignited a searing, immediate resurgence of every terror I had been trying to contain and manage through months of careful emotional control. This wasn't simply fear or the protective instincts that any grandmother would feel. This was a physical pang that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of my soul, a raw ache for their lost innocence and the constant danger they unknowingly lived with every day. I was witnessing the moment when my worst nightmares about their safety transformed from abstract possibilities into concrete, immediate threats. The reality of their constant peril, the knowledge that they were growing up in an environment where weapons and criminal associates were normal parts of daily life, crashed down on me with an intensity that left me breathless and shaking. This was the life I had bargained away through my silence and cooperation, my grandchildren's childhood poisoned by proximity to violence, their innocence eroded by constant exposure to the tools and techniques of professional criminals, their safety dependent on the whims of a man who viewed them as leverage rather than family. I lunged forward and snatched the knife away before those precious fingers could make contact. My hands trembling not just from the immediate crisis, but from the overwhelming realization of how many similar dangers surrounded them every day without my knowledge or ability to intervene. The weapon felt cold and foreign in my grasp, representing everything evil about the choices I had been forced to make and the compromises I had accepted to keep them alive. Unable to maintain any pretense of composure in the face of such a direct threat to their safety, I retreated into the deepest corners of my mind, allowing myself to finally succumb to the waves of sorrow that had been building for months but had never been fully acknowledged or released. In the privacy of my internal sanctuary, I gave myself permission to feel the complete weight of what I had sacrificed in the name of protecting them. Tears streamed down my face in an endless flow of grief that encompassed not just this single terrifying moment, but the accumulated losses of a lifetime devoted to keeping children safe in an increasingly dangerous world. I wept for their childhoods that were being poisoned by his presence, for the innocence they were losing simply by growing up in this environment, for the moral purity I had sacrificed to ensure their physical survival. I cried for the shattered illusion of safety that had once made my home feel like a sanctuary rather than a criminal headquarters. This wasn't a moment of weakness or breakdown, though anyone observing might have interpreted it that way. It was a raw, necessary outpouring of soul-crushing despair that had been suppressed for too long, an acknowledgement that some wounds, especially those involving such profound moral compromise and constant threats to loved ones, never fully heal or disappear. The grief wasn't something to be overcome or resolved through time or positive thinking. It was a permanent feature of the landscape of my life, now a constant companion that would sometimes retreat into the background but would never entirely leave me. Some forms of betrayal and loss leave scars so deep they become part of the architecture of the soul, changing not just how we see the world, but how we exist within it. In my overwhelming need for some form of human connection and validation, during a rare moment when my kind neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stopped by for one of her brief, unsupervised visits, my carefully maintained defenses finally cracked just enough to allow a few desperate words to escape. The need to be seen and acknowledged as more than just a problem to be managed had become so intense that I could no longer contain it completely. Mrs. Henderson had always possessed an intuitive understanding that went beyond normal neighborly concern, an ability to see past surface appearances to the authentic suffering that existed beneath. Mrs. Henderson, I whispered, my voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of months of suppressed agony. Sometimes a grandmother finds herself making difficult choices for her little ones. Sometimes the world forces decisions that go against everything you believe, but you make them anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. The words emerged from somewhere beyond my conscious control, fragmented confessions that I hadn't planned to make, but couldn't seem to stop once they began flowing. My eyes pleaded with her for understanding, for some sign that another human being could recognize the impossible position I had been placed in without requiring me to explain details that could endanger us both. Mrs. Henderson's response was immediate and profound, her eyes filled with a depth of understanding that went far beyond her years of life. Experience met mine without flinching or looking away. There was no judgment in her expression, no demand for explanations that I couldn't safely provide. "I know, dear," she said softly, reaching out to squeeze my hand with a warmth that carried decades of genuine human compassion. A mother's love, a grandmother's love, it knows no bounds. Sometimes it asks us to carry burdens that seem impossible, but we carry them anyway, because that's what love does. Her carefully chosen words acknowledged both my burden and the impossible nature of my situation, without requiring me to provide details that could put either of us in danger. In that moment of shared silent vulnerability, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of isolation that had been suffocating me for so long. It wasn't about finding solutions or planning strategies for escape. It was about being seen and believed by another human being who recognized my suffering as real and valid, despite the impossible circumstances that had created it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt less alone with the weight of what I carried. Later that week, while observing my son-in-law during one of his performances as the devoted family man playing with the children in our living room while maintaining his facade of normalcy and respectability, I found myself studying him with the detached fascination of someone trying to understand how evil could present such an attractive face to the world. His charisma, so effective in convincing outsiders of his sincerity and success, seemed increasingly brittle and artificial to my educated eye. The laughter he shared with my grandchildren never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, carrying an undertone of performance that suggested he was acting out a role rather than experiencing genuine emotion. While the world saw his rising financial success and apparent devotion to family, I could see the empty core that drove his ruthless ambition, the gnawing hunger for power and control that no amount of criminal proceeds could ever truly satisfy. His inability to form genuine connections without calculating their potential usefulness was evident even in his interactions with his own children. His happiness built entirely on my fear, and his criminal enterprises was ultimately a hollow victory that required constant performance to maintain its credibility. It was a monument to the emptiness that existed where his conscience should have been a constant reminder of how completely he had sacrificed his humanity in pursuit of wealth and power obtained through the systematic destruction of everything that should have mattered most to him. During one of my quiet moments of mental story composition, when I was carefully adding new details to the comprehensive chronicle I kept within my memory, I found my attention drawn to the small basil plant I had been secretly tending on my windowsill. This tiny symbol of life persisting under impossible conditions had become far more than just a hidden act of rebellion. It had evolved into my teacher and companion in the struggle for spiritual survival. The plant was clearly thriving, despite its severely confined space, its vibrant green leaves reaching persistently toward whatever sunlight managed to filter through the window, despite the obstacles and limitations that surrounded it. Its roots had somehow found nourishment in the small amount of soil I could provide, and its growth continued with the kind of determination that spoke of something indestructible in the natural order. Despite the cramped conditions and the constant threat of discovery that made caring for it dangerous, the basil plant maintained its essential nature while adapting to circumstances that should have been impossible to survive. It served as living proof that growth and beauty were possible even in the most controlled and hostile environments, that life could find ways to flourish even when surrounded by forces designed to destroy it. As I watched the interplay of light and shadow across its delicate leaves, comparing its struggle to my own fight for survival, it struck me with sudden overwhelming clarity that life in its grand and mysterious design often mirrors exactly this kind of resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. There are unseen forces of darkness constantly at work in every human society, attempting to corrupt and destroy the moral foundations that give meaning to our existence, just as there are cycles of fear and intimidation that seem to repeat themselves throughout history, regardless of how much progress we believe we have made toward justice and truth. Yet there is also an inherent drive within all living things to persist to maintain whatever core of authenticity can be preserved despite every assault upon our values and beliefs. My personal torment, while devastating and all-consuming from my limited perspective, was actually part of this larger pattern of human experience that connected my suffering to something much greater than individual tragedy. The fragility of integrity in a world that often rewards those who abandon their principles for personal safety. The insidious nature of evil that disguises itself as necessity or family loyalty. The enduring strength of spirits that refuse to surrender their essential selves, even when surrounded by forces designed to corrupt them. These were not unique features of my story, but universal themes that had been playing out since the beginning of human civilization. This realization didn't diminish the reality of my suffering or make my moral compromises any less painful, but it placed them in a context that somehow made them more bearable. I was part of an ancient tradition of souls who had faced impossible choices between safety and conscience, who had been forced to choose between protecting those they loved and maintaining their own moral purity. The basil plant on my windowsill was both my teacher and my companion in this struggle, showing me daily that survival with dignity was possible even under the most hostile conditions, that essential nature could be preserved even when external circumstances demanded compromises that seemed to violate everything we believed about ourselves. That evening, sitting alone in my room while holding my precious locket close to my heart, feeling its weight as both comfort and reminder of better times, I made a conscious, deliberate choice that would fundamentally transform my relationship with the nightmare I was living. I chose to release the desperate, consuming need that had been torturing me for months. The need to fully understand why my son-in-law possessed such calculating cruelty, why his depravity had become the defining reality of our family's existence, why justice remained so elusive when the evidence of his crimes was so obvious to anyone who cared to look. I had spent countless sleepless nights trying to find rational explanations for his irrational evil, searching my memories for some early warning sign that could have prepared me for this level of corruption, trying to understand how someone could systematically destroy the people who should have been most precious to him, simply to advance his criminal ambitions. But sitting there in the gentle lamplight, surrounded by the oppressive silence of a house that had been transformed into a criminal headquarters, I finally accepted that some questions about human evil, about the pervasive grip of organized crime on communities and families, about the way moral compromise can gradually consume everything good in a person's character, might simply never have answers that could satisfy my need for understanding. Some darkness in the human soul runs deeper than logic or empathy, can reach some forms of corruption spread so systematically that they become indistinguishable from normal business practices. The why of his transformation was ultimately less important than the how of my own survival, less relevant than my ability to preserve whatever remained of my authentic self while protecting my family from the worst consequences of his choices. In that moment of surrender, in finally letting go of the need for perfect comprehension of his motivations and complete understanding of how our family had reached this point, a fragile but genuine sense of peace began to settle over me like a warm blanket on a cold night. This wasn't the peace of resolution or justice served, but something deeper and more lasting. The peace that comes from accepting the limits of human understanding and finding meaning not in answers, but in the very act of enduring with love intact. This was an act of profound wisdom that had taken me 6 decades and unimaginable testing to achieve this acceptance that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, not all wounds are meant to heal completely, and that some burdens are simply to be carried with whatever grace and quiet dignity we can muster, while clinging to our own truth, however compromised it might become. I found myself discovering a deep, fragile peace that existed not in escape or external resolution of my circumstances, but in the simple, profound act of enduring while holding on to my essential truth, however solitary and morally compromised that truth had become. My life was profoundly imperfect, stripped of the freedom and security I had once taken for granted, surrounded by criminal activity that made every day feel dangerous and uncertain. But my inner world, my fundamental moral compass that distinguished right from wrong, my love for my family that had motivated every compromise and sacrifice, these remained mine in ways that no external force could touch or claim. The fear that had once threatened to consume me entirely still lingered like a persistent ache, and the guilt over my forced complicity remained a constant companion that colored every experience with sorrow. But these painful realities no longer dominated my consciousness entirely or threatened to drive me toward complete despair as they had in the early days of my awakening to the true nature of my situation. I had learned to coexist with fear and guilt rather than being consumed by them, to find pockets of peace and meaning within circumstances that seemed designed to destroy both. This imperfect peace, forged in the crucible of my terrifying reality and tempered by months of learning to survive psychological warfare, was a testament to something indestructible in the human spirit. It was proof of our tenacious will to preserve whatever is most essential in our character, even when justice feels unattainable, even when we're forced to live within constant oppressive threats that never fully disappear. The peace I had found was a triumph of inner integrity over outer tyranny, a victory that existed independent of external circumstances or the possibility of future vindication. It represented a grim but genuine acceptance of my role as a reluctant accomplice, someone who had chosen family survival over moral purity and found ways to live with that choice without losing her essential humanity. While his physical presence remained as oppressive as ever, his criminal enterprise continuing to operate out of my home with the efficiency of a well-established business, I began to notice that his insidious power over my internal world was starting to diminish in subtle but significant ways. The constant psychological manipulation that had once threatened to drive me completely insane was beginning to lose its ability to make me question the fundamental reality of my own moral perceptions. His threats, though persistent and delivered with the same calculated precision as always, no longer held the power to make me doubt my sanity or the validity of my understanding of right and wrong. I was gradually learning to create and maintain an internal sanctuary, a protected space within my consciousness where his malevolence could not fully penetrate, where the truth of who I really was could exist safely beyond his reach. This sanctuary wasn't perfect or completely secure, but it was mine, built from the materials of authentic love and genuine moral conviction that no amount of external manipulation could entirely destroy. His grip on my sanity, while not completely broken, was definitely loosening with each day that I proved to myself that I could maintain my essential humanity despite being forced to enable his criminal activities. What had once felt like an iron cage around my thoughts was becoming more like a shadow that followed me, but could no longer define the totality of my existence. This gradual liberation was perhaps the most important victory I could claim. Not the dramatic triumph of justice served or freedom restored, but the quiet, persistent triumph of refusing to let evil have the final word in determining who I was or what my life meant. His influence was becoming a fading shadow in the landscape of my profound, hard-won endurance, a testament to the enduring strength of my spirit, even as my home remained his operational headquarters, and I remained a silent witness to his crimes and my own reluctant complicity. The encounter came not from the outside world, which had become increasingly dangerous and unpredictable, but from deep within the protected sanctuary of my own consciousness, emerging like a gift from the depths of memory and love that no amount of external control could completely suppress or corrupt. It happened during one of those twilight moments between day and evening when I was sitting by my window watching my grandchildren play in our small backyard, their innocent laughter creating a soundtrack of normalcy that felt both precious and heartbreaking, given everything I knew about the criminal activities surrounding their daily lives. In this profound, almost meditative state of consciousness, I experienced what felt like a perfectly clear vision that transported me back through the decades to a time when love existed without compromise and the future held nothing but promise and hope for the family I was building. I saw myself as a young mother holding my daughter as a tiny baby, her perfect face, peaceful in sleep, while I whispered promises that seemed so simple and achievable at the time. I had promised her safety from the world's dangers, promised her a life better than anything I had known, promised her that my love would be sufficient protection against whatever challenges might arise. I could feel the weight of her small body in my arms, remember the distinctive scent of baby powder and innocence that had filled our humble apartment, recall the overwhelming surge of protective instinct that had made me believe I could shield her from any harm through the pure force of maternal devotion. It was a perfect, unadulterated moment from my past when love existed without fear or moral compromise, when the choices between right and wrong seemed clear and absolute, when I believed that goodness would naturally triumph over evil if you just loved hard enough and sacrificed deeply enough for the people who mattered most. This wasn't a delusion or wishful thinking designed to escape from unbearable present circumstances. This was an internal reunion with my authentic self, a profound and undeniable connection to the truth of the love that had motivated every compromise, every sacrifice, every morally agonizing choice I had made in the years that followed. The vision served as a defiant echo against the grim present proof that the woman who had made those innocent promises still existed somewhere within me, despite everything that had happened to complicate and corrupt the simple purity of that early love. Alternatively, or perhaps simultaneously, the moment of clarity might have come from suddenly recalling with perfect precision a specific detail from one of my mental chronicles, a particular code word or behavioral pattern that I had observed and documented, but whose significance had only now become clear. Perhaps it was the way certain phone conversations followed predictable scripts, or the manner in which money changed hands during business meetings, or the systematic way threats were delivered to maintain control over reluctant participants in his criminal network. Whatever the specific trigger, something in my accumulated observations suddenly resonated with unsettling precision, confirming the pervasive and sophisticated nature of the evil I was being forced to enable. This recovered insight validated months of careful mental documentation while simultaneously revealing new layers of complexity in his criminal operations that I was only beginning to understand. It was proof that my efforts to bear witness had been more successful than I had realized, that the truth was being preserved even when it couldn't be safely shared. This brief but perfect internal encounter didn't ignite the rage or desperate fury that such insights might have triggered during the earlier stages of my captivity emotions that would have been both understandable and justified given the scope of betrayal and corruption I had uncovered. Instead, it brought a complex, profound ache that seemed to encompass not just my current situation, but the entire tragedy of human existence in a world where love could be turned into a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. It was a searing reminder of the purity of my past intentions, of the naive belief that love alone could shield my family from the world's darker realities, of all the what-if questions that would never have satisfying answers. What if I had been stronger, smarter, more suspicious? What if I had recognized the warning signs earlier? What if I had found some way to truly protect them without becoming complicit in the very evil I was trying to shield them from the sight of my authentic self, in that recovered memory, innocent and optimistic about her ability to create safety through love alone, filled me with both profound sorrow and bittersweet gratitude. The pain of my stolen integrity was indeed duller now than it had been in those first devastating weeks of understanding my situation, worn smooth by months of constant pressure until it had become a manageable ache rather than a sharp agony. But the echo of that loss persisted like a low note that continues to vibrate long after the instrument has been silenced, a deep, visceral sense of an unfinished narrative that would never have a satisfying conclusion or provide the kind of resolution that might allow me to fully heal from what had been done to our family. My mind felt free, and my spirit soared with this chilling clarity about the true nature of the love that had led me into this impossible situation. But my body remained confined within the physical boundaries they had established around me. I was a silent testament to a life that had been lived with the best intentions, endured with whatever courage I could muster, and tragically compromised by forces larger than any individual could control or overcome. The truth about the purity of my original motivations had become my constant agonizing companion, a reminder that good intentions were not always sufficient protection against evil that operated with professional efficiency and systematic cruelty. My first instinct, a fleeting thought that arose in that lucid internal space where my authentic self still resided, was to somehow break free from my physical and emotional constraints and find a way to scream my truth to the world until someone heard and believed and acted to restore some measure of justice to our situation. The desire to expose the intricate web of criminal deceit that had consumed my family burned briefly but intensely, like a flame that could consume all the careful resignation I had built around my circumstances. I wanted to tear away his masks in public, to force the world to see the predator hiding behind the facade of family devotion and business success. But even as that impulse arose, the harsh reality of my physical limitations and the layers of control he maintained over every aspect of my environment flooded back into my consciousness like cold water extinguishing fire. The insidious threats he had made against my grandchildren, the systematic destruction of my credibility with anyone who might have helped me, the professional efficiency with which he had isolated me from potential sources of support. All of these factors made any dramatic action not just futile, but potentially catastrophic for the very people I was trying to protect. I knew with painful certainty that any attempt to break free would only result in devastating retaliation, while achieving nothing positive for the cause of justice or truth. He had built his defenses so carefully and completely that struggling against them would only provide him with justification for escalating his control and perhaps eliminating me entirely as a threat to his continued prosperity. So I simply absorbed the vibrant truth of what I had seen and understood, clutching it tight within the sanctuary of my consciousness, where it could never be stolen or corrupted, and then slowly, deliberately return to my quiet vigilance and careful endurance. There would be no dramatic escape from my circumstances, no neat resolution that would restore everything that had been taken from me, or punish those who deserved to face consequences for their crimes. My choice, as it had been from the beginning, was to endure with whatever dignity I could preserve to continue my quiet internal struggle for meaning and authenticity, while accepting that true freedom sometimes meant embracing its devastating absence in the physical world. This wasn't surrender, but rather a form of strategic wisdom, recognizing that some battles must be fought entirely within the realm of consciousness and conscience, rather than through external action that could endanger the innocent while accomplishing nothing meaningful for the cause of justice. My spirit, though tethered to a body that remained under his control, felt somehow lighter after this encounter, imbued with a newfound sense of internal freedom that existed independent of external circumstances. The understanding I had gained about the pure love that had motivated my choices provided context that helped me make sense of my own suffering while connecting it to something larger than personal tragedy. My physical existence remained heavy and constrained, marked by the ever-present ache of moral compromise and loss that would never completely disappear. The shadow of his criminal enterprise continued to loom over every aspect of my daily reality, a dark, unresolved current beneath the surface of whatever peace I managed to create. But my journey was continuing, not toward any kind of happy ending that would restore what had been lost, but toward a profound understanding of how love could persist, even when it seemed to lead only to compromise and corruption, how dignity could be maintained even in the most impossible circumstances, how the human spirit could find meaning even within the most complete moral captivity. My mind had become my true sanctuary, a place where I could dwell in freedom, even as my body remained a prisoner. This internal liberation was perhaps the only victory possible under my circumstances, but it was real and meaningful, and entirely mine, in ways that no external force could touch or claim. One quiet night, as I lay in my bed, with my body heavy from the accumulated stress of months of forced complicity, but my mind achieving a clarity that sometimes emerged in the deepest hours of solitude, I experienced what I can only describe as a moment of ultimate internal understanding that seemed to emanate from the deepest wisdom I had accumulated through 6 decades of living and these months of unimaginable moral testing. This profound clarity wasn't about finding answers to the questions that had tormented me for so long. Why such calculated evil had infected my family. Why love could be turned into a weapon of coercion. Why the world remained indifferent to corruption that operated in plain sight among apparently respectable citizens. Those questions still existed, but they no longer held the power to drive me toward madness with their unanswered persistence. Instead, this ultimate understanding was about achieving a state of acceptance that transcended my desperate need for solutions, explanations, or external justice. It was a deep, sorrowful peace, born not of resolution, but of finally comprehending something fundamental about the tragic nature of human existence, the terrible choices that love sometimes demands, and the way moral compromise can become a form of sacrifice when protecting the innocent requires enabling evil. I was finally beginning to grasp that some of life's most painful dilemmas exist beyond the reach of rational solution, that there are circumstances so complex and dangerous that they defy every attempt to find responses that preserve both physical safety and moral purity. The why of my suffering was ultimately less important than the how of my endurance, less relevant than my ability to preserve whatever core of love and authenticity remained accessible to me, despite the impossible choices I had been forced to make. This wasn't defeat or moral surrender, but rather the most profound form of wisdom I had ever achieved. A recognition that some battles cannot be won through external action, but only through the internal triumph of refusing to let circumstances destroy the essential goodness that motivates our choices, even when those choices seem to violate everything we believe about right and wrong. I consciously embraced the humbling realization that some of life's deepest moral dilemmas, especially those involving the protection of innocent family members from professional criminals, might never have solutions that satisfy our human need for clear ethical guidelines and comfortable moral certainty. This acceptance wasn't a surrender to despair or abandonment of hope for meaning in existence, but rather a profound act of wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of impossible choices and systematic intimidation. It was a letting go of the illusion that love could always find ways to protect without compromise, a recognition that some forms of evil are so sophisticated and ruthless that resistance can only increase the danger to those we're trying to protect. My understanding of the human condition had deepened through these months of forced complicity, leading me to acknowledge that corruption and violence exist as fundamental realities in our world, and that sometimes the only path to preserving what matters most requires accepting moral compromises that seem to violate everything we believe about ourselves. The battle wasn't about defeating him or exposing his crimes to a world that had chosen to remain blind to obvious signs of criminal activity. It was about holding on to whatever truth remained within me, however fragmented and morally complicated that truth had become through months of impossible choices made under threat of violence against children. This philosophical shift was subtle, but fundamental, changing not what I experienced, but how I related to that experience. Instead of measuring my worth by my ability to maintain moral purity in impossible circumstances, I was learning to find meaning in the very act of surviving with my love for my family intact, of refusing to let his cruelty transform me into someone incapable of sacrifice and devotion. The understanding that emerged was that love could exist even in the most morally compromised circumstances, that protecting the innocent sometimes required accepting guilt and shame that felt unbearable, but was actually evidence of preserved conscience rather than lost integrity. With a gentle, almost imperceptible sigh that seemed to release something I had been holding too tightly for far too long, I closed my eyes and performed a subtle internal act of letting go that felt like setting down a burden I hadn't realized was still weighing me down. This was a silent prayer, not for the miraculous intervention that would restore my previous life, or the dramatic revelation that would punish those who had corrupted it, but for the continued strength to love my family, even when that love required choices that seemed to violate everything I believed about moral behavior. I felt a profound sense of liberation in the very act of learning to live with moral ambiguity and ethical compromise, recognizing that this agonizing situation was now an integral part of my story, but no longer its complete definition. The question of whether I would ever see justice served the unresolved nature of my forced complicity, the ongoing prosperity of those who had trapped me in this impossible situation. These painful realities no longer had the power to define the totality of my existence. I had discovered a form of freedom that I never could have imagined in the early days of recognizing my situation. Not freedom from moral compromise, which continued to be a daily reality, but freedom within compromise, the ability to maintain love and essential humanity, even when external circumstances demanded choices that seemed to violate every principle I had ever held sacred. The story of my life, though marked by choices so morally complex, they challenged my understanding of what it meant to be a good person, had not succeeded in breaking the essential core of who I was. The people who had set out to use my love against me had failed in their ultimate objective of destroying my capacity for sacrifice and devotion, because they had only been able to touch the external aspects of my moral choices without reaching the internal motivation that made those choices expressions of love rather than betrayals of principle. They could force me to enable criminal activity, threaten my family into silence, and transform my home into a base of operations for serious crimes. But they could not reach the deepest parts of my consciousness, where my love for my grandchildren continued to exist as the purest and most authentic part of who I was. Instead of destroying me, these experiences had deepened my understanding of what love actually means in ways that might never have been possible under easier circumstances, transforming me into someone capable of profound wisdom about the terrible prices that protection sometimes demands and the complex relationship between moral purity and practical love. The trials I had endured had burned away everything superficial and comfortable about my understanding of right and wrong, leaving behind something more essential and lasting than simple rule following or easy moral choices. My compromise had become paradoxically a form of moral heroism, not the kind that gets celebrated in stories, but the kind that saves lives through silent sacrifice. I had found peace not in vindication, but in acceptance, not in moral purity, but in the knowledge that I had chosen love over principle when the two came into irreconcilable conflict. The profound quiet wisdom I had gained was not something that could be easily shared or explained to others, but it was real and substantial, a foundation upon which I could build whatever remained of my life, regardless of external circumstances. This ultimate acceptance carried within it a bittersweet but genuine peace that no one could steal from me. I was no longer fighting against my situation, but learning to find meaning within it, no longer seeking escape, but discovering that the truest freedom existed in the knowledge that I had sacrificed everything, including my own moral comfort, to protect the people I loved most in the world.